The old diner sat at the corner of a quiet street in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small family-run restaurant that had been around for decades. The kind of place where time stood still. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee, bacon, and warm apple pie. The jukebox played an old Frank Sinatra song, and the few customers inside spoke in hushed voices. It was just another normal day. Then, the door opened. Joe Biden, the President of the United States, walked in, followed by his security detail. He was dressed simply. Blue shirt, sleeves rolled up. No grand entrance, no cameras. Just a man looking for a hot cup of coffee and a chance to talk to regular folks. The older couple sitting by the window recognized him first. The woman gasped and clutched her husband's hand. A man at the counter whispered, "That's Biden." But before he could take a seat, something happened that no one expected. A waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, walked up, swallowed hard, and said, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The entire diner went silent. Biden blinked, confused. His security team tensed up, their hands hovering over their earpieces. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. The waitress hesitated, looking almost regretful. Then she whispered something that made the president's face turn pale. "I'm so sorry, sir, but the owner, he doesn't want you here." For the first time in years, Joe Biden found himself completely speechless. The President of the United States, leader of the free world, was being told to leave a small-town diner. A heavy silence filled the room. His security team moved forward ready to intervene, but Biden raised a hand. He looked at the waitress, really looked at her. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, her uniform slightly wrinkled, dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't being rude. If anything, she looked embarrassed. "Who told you to say that?" he asked gently. The girl's eyes darted toward the kitchen, where a gray-haired man stood with his arms crossed. His expression was cold, unforgiving. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice shaky. I don't want to lose my job." Biden exhaled slowly. He could have pushed back, demanded to know why, but instead he did something no one expected. He nodded. He turned toward the door and started walking out. No security, no protest. Just an old man leaving a place where he was unwelcome. The door creaked as he pushed it open. But then, something happened. A voice, weak but steady, rang out from the back of the diner. "Let him stay." Everyone turned. It was an old woman, 80, maybe 90 years old, sitting alone in a booth. She had thin white hair and wore a pearl necklace that looked older than time. Her eyes, sharp with wisdom, met Biden's. She remembered him. She remembered the young senator who had fought for the working class, the man who had faced tragedy but kept going. Tears welled in her eyes. "Let him stay," she repeated, stronger this time. And suddenly, something inside the room shifted. The tension in the air cracked like glass. The diner owner, still standing in the kitchen, clenched his jaw. His hands gripped the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. Biden turned around. He didn't say a word, just looked at the old woman with gratitude. Then he turned his gaze to the owner. "Sir," Biden finally said, his voice steady. "I don't know why you don't want me here, but I didn't come for politics. I came for a cup of coffee." The man didn't respond. His face was unreadable. Then, the old woman spoke again. "You were there, Joe." Her voice trembled. "You wrote the letter that saved my husband's pension in '94. He died knowing his family would be okay because of you." A tear slipped down her wrinkled cheek. "My son," she swallowed hard. "He died in Iraq, fighting for this country. And I lost my grandson to cancer 2 years ago." Biden's eyes softened. She wiped her tears, her hands shaking. "But when you lost your son, I cried for you too." The diner was silent except for the sound of a single coffee cup rattling on a saucer. The owner sighed, looking at the old woman, then at Biden. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. And then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said the last thing anyone expected. "My brother died last year. Because of your policies." The air in the room turned ice cold. The emotional weight of the moment crashed down like a tidal wave. Tears swelled in the waitress's eyes. The old woman covered her mouth. Biden just stood there. His voice, raw with emotion, finally broke the silence. "Tell me his name." The owner hesitated. Then, his lips trembled as he whispered, "David." Biden nodded, his eyes glistening. "Tell me about David." And just like that, something no one expected happened. The diner owner, this cold, angry man, broke down in tears. The moment the name left the diner owner's lips, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. David. Joe Biden felt the weight of it. He had met many Davids, young men who had dreams, families, futures. Some had served their country, some had fought their own battles at home. Biden swallowed. "Tell me about him." The owner, who had stood so firm, so unmovable, lowered his eyes. His lips trembled. His hands clenched the counter as if trying to hold on to something that was already gone. He was my little brother." His voice cracked. He was 52, never smoked, never drank, worked 2 jobs, and then he sucked in a breath. Then the cancer came. Biden's jaw tightened. He had heard this story before, too many times. The man's voice grew raw. "The hospital bills took everything. My parents' house, his savings. We begged for help, but the system, it failed us." A tear slipped down his face. "He died in my arms, Mr. President. He was holding my hand, asking me if I thought heaven was real." Biden's own eyes filled with tears. He had been there before. He had held Beau's hand as he took his last breath. The diner was silent. Only the sound of muffled sobs filled the air. And then, Biden did something no one expected. He reached across the counter and took the man's hand. "I believe it's real," Biden whispered. "And I believe David is there." The owner, who had spent years carrying his anger, his grief, felt something inside him crack. He wanted to scream. He wanted to say it was all Biden's fault. The economy, the healthcare system, the politicians who made promises but never fixed anything. But when he looked into Biden's eyes, he saw something that silenced him. Pain. Real, deep pain. The kind only someone who had lost everything could understand. Biden squeezed his hand tighter. "I lost my wife, my daughter, my son." His voice was hoarse. "And every day I ask myself if I did enough. If I fought hard enough. If I could have changed the world fast enough to save them." The owner trembled. He had spent so long hating men like Biden, blaming them. But in that moment, he didn't see a politician. He saw a father, a grieving man who carried more than most could bear. Biden continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know your pain." And that was it. The owner let go of the anger he had gripped for so long. He sobbed. Deep, broken sobs that shook his whole body. The waitress wiped her tears. The old woman in the corner nodded slowly as if she had been waiting for this moment. And then, something even more shocking happened. The owner let go of Biden's hand and hugged him. No one in the diner moved. The security detail watched, unsure of what to do. The customers held their breath. But Biden, he hugged the man back. And in that moment there were no sides, no politics, no left, no right. Just 2 men, both broken, both hurting, both longing for a world that had treated them unfairly. The cameras weren't there. The news wasn't there. This was real. The owner pulled away, wiping his face. He looked down, almost ashamed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Biden shook his head. "Don't be. Grief is heavy. Anger is easier to carry." The old woman in the corner spoke up. Her voice was soft but strong. "This world is cruel," she said. "But moments like this, they remind us that we're still human." The owner cleared his throat. His hand still shook. Then, he reached under the counter and grabbed a coffee cup. He filled it slowly, steam rising from the dark liquid. And then, with trembling hands, he set it in front of Biden. "No charge," he whispered. Biden looked at the cup, then at the man. He gave him a small nod of thanks. And then, as he lifted the cup to his lips, the door swung open, and the entire world came rushing in. The moment the door swung open, the quiet diner turned into chaos. A flood of flashing lights, shouting voices, and hurried footsteps filled the space. Reporters, cameramen, and news anchors stormed in like a wave crashing against the shore. "Mr. President, why were you asked to leave? Sir, was this an act of discrimination? Do you feel disrespected?" Biden sighed. The world had arrived too soon. The diner owner stepped back, panic flashing across his face. He never wanted this. He never expected this moment to become something so big. The waitress looked like she was going to cry. The old woman clutched her pearls, shaking her head at the madness unfolding before her. The president didn't answer the reporters. He just sat there looking down at the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. And then, he did something that sent a shockwave through the room. He picked up the coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. It was as if time itself had stopped. No speeches, no anger. Just a quiet sip of coffee in a place that had asked him to leave. The cameras kept flashing. The country was watching. And Biden, he just sat there waiting. The reporters expected him to lash out, to demand an apology, to turn this into a political moment. But Joe Biden had lived too long for that. Instead, he placed the coffee cup down gently and looked up at the diner owner. "David was a good man," Biden said softly. "He worked hard. He deserved better." The owner swallowed hard. The cameras caught every emotion flickering across his face. The world was watching him now. This was no longer just about a cup of coffee. It wasn't about politics. It was about something deeper: pain, loss, and a nation struggling to find its humanity. The old woman in the corner wiped her eyes. The waitress stepped closer, as if wanting to say something but not knowing how. The diner, once just a small roadside stop, had now become the center of the world. The owner's hands trembled. His whole body shook. And then, in a moment that no one saw coming, he did something that left the entire nation in stunned silence. He walked around the counter, stood before the President of the United States, and got down on his knees. The diner owner's knees hit the floor with a soft thud. Gasps filled the room. Even the reporters hungry for a story didn't know what to say. Tears streamed down his face. His body shook with emotion. "I was wrong," he choked out. "I was so angry, so broken. I let my pain turn into hate, and I took it out on you." The cameras zoomed in. Millions of Americans sat in front of their TVs, unable to look away. Biden reached forward, his own eyes misty. He touched the man's shoulder. "You're not alone," Biden whispered. The owner let out a deep, shuddering breath. His grief, his sorrow, it was all spilling out in front of the world. And then, Biden did something that left everyone speechless. He got down on his knees too. Two men, two broken souls, kneeling together on the floor of a small-town diner, not as president and citizen, not as opponents, but as two grieving men who had lost too much. The cameras captured every second. The nation, divided for so long, felt something stir deep in their hearts, and somewhere, in the homes of millions, people began to cry. The air inside the diner felt thick, heavy. Two men, one a grieving brother, the other a grieving father, knelt on the cold, tiled floor. The cameras kept rolling. The entire country was glued to their screens, watching something they had never expected. Joe Biden didn't see the cameras. He didn't hear the reporters whispering. He only saw the man in front of him, the man who had lost his brother to a cruel world, just as Biden had lost Beau. The diner owner covered his face with his hands, his body shaking. "I just miss him," he sobbed. Biden placed a hand on his shoulder, gripping it tightly. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The owner lifted his head, eyes red, searching for something. Answers, hope, maybe even forgiveness. Biden's voice was steady but soft. "The pain never leaves, but neither does the love." The cameras caught everything. The entire world was silent. No politics, no debates, just raw, human grief. Then for the first time, the diner owner did something no one expected. He hugged the President of the United States, and Joe Biden, without hesitation, hugged him back. For a long time, the diner was silent. Then, one by one, people in the room began to cry. The waitress wiped her tears, her hands shaking. The old woman at the booth clutched her chest, whispering, "God bless them." Even the reporters, trained to stay professional, found their throats tight. Because in that moment it wasn't about sides. It wasn't about Democrats or Republicans, left or right. It was about grief, about loss, about love. And suddenly, something incredible happened. A man sitting at the counter, gray-haired, a Vietnam veteran's cap on his head, stood up. Slowly, he walked over to Biden and the diner owner. And then, without a word, he knelt beside them. Another man followed, then a woman, then another. And before long, every person in that diner, young, old, rich, poor, was kneeling together. For a moment, there was no America divided, no anger, no shouting, just people, kneeling together, grieving together, healing together. And the cameras caught it all. Millions of Americans watching from their homes felt something deep inside them shift. And across the country, people wept. As the moment stretched on, no one wanted to be the first to stand. Joe Biden slowly wiped his eyes, looking around at the people kneeling beside him. Strangers, yet bound together by something bigger than themselves. The diner owner finally took a breath. He turned to Biden, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you." Biden shook his head. "No, thank you." The reporters had never seen anything like it. Some of them even forgot to hold their microphones. And then, just as softly as it had begun, Biden reached out a hand to the diner owner, helping him stand. The others followed, rising one by one. No one clapped, no one cheered. The moment was too sacred for that. Then Biden did something simple, something powerful. He reached for his cup of coffee, took one last sip and said, "Good coffee." The entire diner chuckled, a soft, warm sound that broke the tension. And just like that, the heaviness lifted. But what happened next? That would be a story for the history books. As the weight of the moment settled, Biden set down his empty coffee cup. His fingers lingered on the rim for just a second, as if holding on to something unspoken. The diner owner, his face still red from crying, rubbed his hands together. The cameras were still rolling, but for once no one seemed to care. The old woman at the booth, who had been silent for some time, suddenly spoke. "Mr. President, do you remember Scranton?" she asked, her voice carrying the wisdom of years. Biden turned his gaze toward her. His lips twitched into a small smile. "I remember every street, every porch, every factory." She nodded. "You and my husband used to play stickball as kids." Biden's eyes widened. "Who was your husband?" Her eyes glistened. "Johnny Peterson." Biden exhaled sharply. "Johnny?" His voice was almost boyish. "Johnny was my best friend." The old woman smiled through her tears. "He always believed in you." The diner was silent, except for the soft sniffles of those who had been deeply moved. The weight of history, of life, of time itself, pressed down on the room. Then she said something that broke everyone's heart. "He passed last winter. He told me. He wanted to see you one last time." Biden's hands trembled. The cameras caught everything. And the nation wept. A deep sadness washed over Biden's face. He ran a hand down his cheek, his fingers brushing away a tear. "I wish I had known," he whispered. The old woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small, faded photograph. She placed it on the table. It was a black and white picture of two young boys, maybe 10 years old. One of them was Joe Biden, the other, Johnny Peterson. They were laughing, arms slung over each other's shoulders like brothers. Biden picked up the photo carefully, as if afraid it might crumble in his hands. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then he let out a deep breath and looked at the old woman. "Thank you," he said softly, "for keeping him alive in your heart." She nodded, her lip trembling. "He always kept you in his." The cameras captured the raw emotion in Biden's eyes. The nation, watching from their homes, felt their chests tighten. Because in that moment, Joe Biden wasn't the president. He was just a man mourning a childhood friend. A man, like millions of others, who had loved and lost. And the world saw him, not as a politician, but as one of them. The old woman reached across the table, placing a frail, wrinkled hand over Biden's. "Would you pray with me, Joe?" Biden didn't hesitate. He nodded, took her hand, and bowed his head. The entire diner followed. Even the reporters, some of whom had never prayed before, felt compelled to close their eyes. The prayer was soft, just a whisper in the storm of a world too often divided. "Lord," the old woman began, "help us remember that grief is love that has nowhere to go. Help us to be kind, even in our sorrow, and help us see one another, not as enemies, but as brothers and sisters." A deep silence followed. When Biden lifted his head, his eyes met the diner owner's. The man swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say." Biden gave him a small, tired smile. "You don't have to." The owner looked down, then back up. And then, he reached for Biden's hand, gripping it tight. The cameras caught the image, the hug, the unity, the moment that transcended politics, anger, and pain. And that photo? That photo would become the image that changed a nation. As the diner settled into silence, Joe Biden sat back, looking around at the faces in the room. Faces of ordinary Americans, people who had seen hard times, who had felt loss, who had been divided by so many things. But tonight, in this small-town diner, they were one. Just as he reached for his coat, a phone rang. It wasn't from a reporter or from the Secret Service. It was from the old woman at the booth. She fumbled for it with shaking hands. I'm sorry," she mumbled, embarrassed. Biden gave her a reassuring smile. "It's okay." She looked at the screen and gasped. Then she looked at Biden, her eyes wide with disbelief. I think it's for you." She turned the phone around, and Biden's heart nearly stopped. The caller ID read, "Barack Obama." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled. The old woman held out the phone, her hands trembling. "Mr. President," she whispered. "He wants to talk to you." Biden took the phone, pressed it to his ear, and said softly, "Hey, pal." The diner was completely silent as Biden listened. Obama's voice was steady, filled with warmth. "I saw the footage, Joe," he said. "I saw what happened." Biden closed his eyes. He could almost picture his old friend sitting in his home, watching the moment unfold like the rest of the world. "I just wanted to tell you," Obama continued, "that tonight you reminded the country of something important." Biden took a deep breath. "What's that?" "That we're still human," Obama said. "That grief and love matter more than politics. That kindness is still possible." Biden's throat tightened. He had spent a lifetime in politics fighting battles he believed in, but sometimes the weight of it all made him wonder if people still saw each other. "Joe," Obama said gently, "this country needs more moments like tonight." Biden looked around the room, the old woman wiping her tears, the diner owner still clutching his hand, the waitress holding back sobs. He swallowed. "I think we all needed this." Obama chuckled softly. "You did good, brother." Biden smiled. Thanks, pal. And then, in front of millions of Americans watching, he handed the phone back to the old woman. Because tonight wasn't about politics. It was about people. Biden stood up slowly. The moment had passed, but something had changed. The diner owner cleared his throat. "Mr. President," he said softly, "if you ever find yourself in town again, coffee's on the house." Biden chuckled, his eyes misty. "I'll hold you to that." The cameras captured his every movement as he turned to leave. But before stepping out, he stopped. He looked at the crowd, the waitress, the veteran, the old woman, the strangers who had all become something more tonight. Then, with the entire nation watching, Biden turned back toward the counter, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a few bills. He set them down. "For the coffee," he said with a small smile. And then, as quietly as he had come in, he walked out into the night. The world was left stunned, not by anger, not by politics, but by kindness. The news anchors called it the night America cried together. The photo of Biden and the diner owner kneeling together became the image of the year. And in homes across the country, people held their loved ones a little tighter. Because for one night, in a small-town diner, America remembered what it meant to be human. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel something deep inside, don't just scroll away. Like this video to share this moment of kindness. Comment below. What part moved you the most? What lesson did you take from this? And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. Because in a world filled with chaos, we need more stories that remind us of hope. Let's keep this spirit alive. Because kindness, love, and unity, that's what truly makes us strong. Subscribe now. Share the love. The Diner Incident.